If we say that the global energy supply chain is the jugular vein maintaining the heartbeat of modern industrial civilization, then the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea shipping lanes in the Middle East are undoubtedly the two most fragile and fatal choke points. When we talk about crude oil, what exactly are we talking about? Is it black gold, the industrial blood tied to the petrodollar hegemony, or an invisible but deadly meat grinder between great powers? In recent years, due to American strategic misjudgments in the Middle East, long-term maximum pressure on Iran, and the spillover effects of taking sides in geopolitical conflicts, like the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the global energy artery is in a state of intermittent cardiac arrest. We see the Houthi-armed drones and missiles in the Red Sea. We see major shipping giants forced to detour around the Cape of Good Hope, directly causing global shipping rates to soar by over 150% in just a few months. Fueled by panic, Brent crude oil prices once rushed dangerously close to the $90 per barrel mark like a runaway horse. This geopolitical panic, with smooth transit delayed indefinitely, has put many countries on pins and needles, facing the abyss of energy supply cuts at any moment. However, those who suffer the most are often not America's rivals, but the allies tied to its war chariot. Take the Philippines, an Asia-Pacific island nation highly dependent on imported energy. Data shows that the energy self-sufficiency rate of the Philippines is extremely low, and the fuel cost of its domestic aviation industry showed a steep parabolic rise during the crisis. Industry reports previously warned that if the Strait crisis continued to ferment and supply chains broke, the Philippines could even fall into a dark moment of massive flight groundings and logistics paralysis at any time. In this global energy anxiety syndrome, the United States has fallen into an extremely comical paradox. It holds a large amount of crude oil extracted through the shale oil revolution, as well as resources forcibly intercepted from other countries. But under high transportation costs and complex sanction entanglements, it surprisingly cannot find a large enough buyer to digest these inventories and cash out. On the surface, the United States has strong financial hegemony. They naturally think that as long as they use the SWIFT system to cut off other countries' fund settlements and send a few aircraft carriers to cruise the high seas, they can forcefully control the flow of global resources. But the actual economic laws are often more ruthless than the sand table deductions of the Pentagon. Faced with the crisis, the most the White House can do is release tens of millions of barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR. You have to know that the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been severely overdrawn in the past few years, with inventories once dropping to a 40-year low, facing the domestic U.S. market that consumes nearly 20 million barrels a day. This sprinkler-like intervention is just a drop in the bucket. Therefore, accompanied by the turbulence in the Middle East waters, the retail price of gasoline in the United States also acts like a runaway horse, directly pushing up the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and backfiring on its own economic fundamentals. This not only consumed the political credit of the current administration, but also made Washington politicians realize that the landmines they planted themselves ultimately blew up the fence of their own backyard. The global energy market is like a precise communicating vessel. The United States tries to smash the other end with a stone, forgetting that the poisonous water in the pipe will eventually flow back with the pressure and flood the lawn of the White House. The backlash of hegemony often does not start with enemy missiles rising from the high seas. It is precisely destined from the moment that invisible sign reading crude oil unsaleable, "Please help us," is hung outside the White House gates. If the setback in the Middle East is the short-sightedness of American geopolitical strategy, then the operation on the Venezuela issue completely exposes the ignorance of Washington politicians in industrial economics. In recent years, the United States has implemented textbook-level financial strangulation and maximum pressure on Venezuela, from forcibly freezing its gold reserves overseas to sanctioning its state-owned oil company PDVSA to engaging in political isolation internationally. The American calculation is very exquisite, kicking a man when he is down. They tried to completely lock down the economic lifeblood of the Maduro government, taking the core assets of this country, with the world's largest proven reserves of over 300 billion barrels of crude oil, without firing a single shot. However, facts have proved that this hegemonic act, full of Cold War thinking, has not only added a heavy diplomatic burden to the Trump administration, but also evolved into an unmitigated disaster on the economic level. the Americans made a fatal common-sense mistake. Did they really think that seizing control of the oil wells is equivalent to printing green dollar bills? This requires us to lift the surface dirt and deeply understand the hopeless physical flaws of Venezuelan oil. In the petroleum industry, there is a key indicator to measure crude oil quality called a PI gravity. Saudi Arabia's light sweet crude, which gushes out just by inserting a pipe, usually has an API gravity above 30, and the refining cost is extremely low, which is a gift from heaven. But what about Venezuela, especially the oil produced in its Orinoco belt? The vast majority belongs to extra-heavy crude. The API gravity of these crude oils is often below 10. What does this mean? It means they are heavier than water, extremely high in sulfur content, and their viscosity at room temperature is comparable to the asphalt used for paving roads. If left in its natural state, it will even coagulate into a nearly solid state. This means you simply cannot use conventional methods to extract and transport it. To make these black asphalts flow in the pipelines, massive amounts of diluents, such as naphtha, must be added, and extremely large, expensive, and technically complex upgraders are required for preliminary processing. Unfortunately, due to years of blockade and sanctions by the United States, coupled with Venezuela's domestic economic turmoil, the country's oil infrastructure, pipelines, and refineries have long been in disrepair and dilapidated. Today's Venezuelan oil industry is like a rusty century-old steam engine, completely unable to meet the practical needs of large-scale, high-efficiency exports. To get this machine running again, the only way is to throw money at it, massive amounts of money. When Washington politicians arrogantly demanded that their own oil giants, such as ExxonMobil and Chevron, go to Venezuela to take over and rebuild, the actuaries on Wall Street let out a cold sneer. The sense of smell of capital is extremely rational. They have not forgotten the painful lesson of Western oil giants losing everything during the wave of asset nationalization in Latin America back in the day. They pulled out complex financial models and did the math. To restore Venezuela's oil industry to its pre-sanctioned capacity of about 3 million barrels per Dalton Y, the initial infrastructure investment gap will be as high as $100 billion to $120 billion. What is more fatal is that due to the exorbitant costs of extracting and refining heavy oil, the return cycle of this investment is stretched infinitely long. At least for the first 10 years, this will be a bottomless pit where you only see money thrown in and no profits coming out. We also need to look further ahead. It is a vigorous new energy transition. The three major economies of China, the United States, and Europe are frantically promoting the popularization of electric vehicles, or EV, and the construction of wind, solar, and nuclear power. 10 years from now, the global demand curve for traditional fossil fuels will most likely welcome a downward inflection point, and the market share of the oil industry will face a reshaping. At that time, who dares to pat their chest and guarantee that those heavy, inferior Venezuelan oils, with extremely high extraction costs and staggering carbon emissions, can still be sold on the market? For this losing business, that could turn into a sunk cost at any time. Except for companies like Chevron, which have a special exemption license and only maintain extremely limited business. No rational transnational capital. Politicians can make empty promises for votes, but capital, for the sake of profit, will absolutely not release the eagle until it sees the rabbit. The United States thought it used the chains of sanctions to lasso a goose that lays golden eggs. Only after using all its strength to drag it back to the White House did it realize that it was actually a prehistoric hedgehog covered in sharp spikes, which must be fed gold bars every day before it is willing to produce a few drops of inferior asphalt. Political power may be able to temporarily freeze the bank account of a sovereign nation, but Washington politicians can never hold a gun to force capital to violate the laws of physics and economic common sense. When the White House's calculations completely stalled in the tar pits of Venezuela, the Trump team's merchant-style tactic of finding a lower-tier buyer stepped onto the stage. Looking at the global energy consumption map at the time, there were very few countries that could swallow massive amounts of Venezuelan heavy crude oil in one breath and had the ability to convert it into real money. Europe was deeply bogged down in environmental political correctness and deindustrialization, while the refining equipment in Japan and South Korea was mostly customized for light Middle Eastern oil. After calculating over and over, there were only two real industrial and demographic behemoths left on this planet. With a large enough energy appetite and the complex refining capabilities to process inferior heavy oil, China and India. Since the Chinese side bought none of this dirty oil with obvious political extortion nature, which we will detail in the next chapter, Trump naturally turned his eager and pressuring gaze to New Delhi. India, under Modi's rule, is a country with an almost pathological thirst for energy. As the world's third largest oil consumer, over 85% of India's crude oil relies on imports, and daily consumption is as high as 5 million barrels. More importantly, India's oil refining industry has completed a reverse evolution in the past 20 years. Take Reliance Industries, Jamnagar refinery complex in Gujarat. As an example, this world's largest refining complex has a Nelson Complexity Index as high as 21.1. What does this mean? It means that the high sulfur, high viscosity, garbage oil, and asphalt oil that others cannot refine, the Indians can completely squeeze dry with their extremely advanced delayed coking and hydrocracking units, convert them into high-value added diesel and aviation kerosene, and then resell them to Europe to earn huge price differences. From an industrial logic perspective, India is simply the perfect buyer for Venezuela's heavy oil. Thus, Trump began his highly oppressive political micromanipulations. Historical details are often hidden in forgotten corners. As early as 2019, the United States boldly cancelled India's zero tariff privileges under the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, citing trade imbalances, causing billions of dollars of Indian export goods to suffer severe setbacks. This time, the White House repeated its old trick, privately offering terms to New Delhi. As long as India was willing to purchase large-scale Venezuelan crude oil sanctioned by the United States, acting as a money laundering ATM for the United States to disguise the plunder of Venezuelan assets. The United States could not only show leniency on tariff issues, but even offer more sweeteners in arms sales for the Indo-Pacific strategy. As a typical realist, Modi was indeed tempted at first after weighing the pros and cons. For a bazaar merchant like India, which pursues great power balance and is accustomed to playing both sides between different camps, as long as the price is right, political morality is never a stumbling block to a deal. However, just as this dirty geopolitical deal was about to be finalized, a dramatic scene appeared. The Middle East geopolitical crisis, detonated by the Trump team itself, acted like a boomerang, accurately shattering their own wishful thinking. With the sudden escalation of the Middle East situation, especially the Red Sea shipping lanes frequently harassed by asymmetric armed forces, the global shipping market fell into unprecedented panic. Very large crude carriers, or VLCC, originally crossing the Atlantic from Venezuela, bypassing the Cape of Good Hope, or arriving at the west coast of India through the Suez Canal, not only faced the fatal risk of being attacked, but their war insurance premium rates and single-trip shipping costs soared by 300%. When the Indians took out their calculators again, they were horrified to find that due to the skyrocketing freight rates, coupled with the extremely high refining cost of Venezuelan heavy oil, this business, which originally relied on a meager price difference for arbitrage, was not only unprofitable but even became a giant pit that lost money. What is even more absurd is that at the exact same time the United States was forcing India to buy Venezuelan oil, its NATO allies in Europe were causing a massive gap in global energy supplies due to extreme sanctions against Russia. At this time, Russian Urals crude oil, sanctioned by the West, was frantically searching for buyers under the cover of a massive international shadow fleet, at a bleeding discount of $20 to $30 per barrel below the Brent benchmark oil price. Faced with two dishes placed in front of them, one was a scalding hot potato forcefully stuffed over by the White House, with sky-high shipping costs and requiring them to look at American faces to import. The other was a cheap, Large bowl served by Russia. With an astonishing discount and a relatively closer transportation distance. India did not become the buyer of Venezuelan crude oil as Trump wished, but instead fired on all cylinders, frantically absorbing Russian crude oil. Data shows that in the period following the outbreak of the crisis, the proportion of India's imported Russian crude oil skyrocketed, exaggeratedly from less than 2% before the crisis to nearly 40%. Faced with this non-violent, uncooperative feigned compliance, Washington, bogged down in the Middle East quagmire, and in urgent need of winning over India in the Indo-Pacific region to balance the United States rivals, ultimately could only swallow its broken teeth and tacitly accept India's crazy sweep of Russian oil in the short term. Washington's geopolitical manipulators are like a group of blind men swinging big sticks in a china shop. They try to use the noise of smashing the Middle East display cabinets to intimidate South Asian customers into paying the bill. But they did not expect that the customers had long slipped out the back door in the chaos and completed their purchases at the neighboring Russian stall. In this multipolar world calculated to the bone, no one will be forever willing to pay for the arrogance of a superpower. When the butcher's knife of hegemony is swung at their own supply chains, even the closest allies will not hesitate to raise the shield of self-preservation. When the door to South Asia was heavily slammed shut, and when calculations in India fell through, the Trump administration found itself completely surrounded in a desperate situation regarding the cashing out of Venezuelan crude oil. Persistently high domestic oil prices and geopolitical stalemates with heavy investments, but zero output had exhausted the White House's patience. In plain terms, Washington at this moment practically wanted to erect a giant billboard on the South Lawn reading, "Crude oil unsaleable, please help us." Driven to a corner, this distress signal was finally directed across the Pacific at China, in an extremely awkward, arrogant, yet secretly expectant posture. Did Trump really naively believe that China would willingly serve as a fencing channel for the United States to plunder Venezuelan state assets? The American calculation was built on an outdated petrodollar closed-loop logic. Ever since Kissinger flew to Riyadh in 1974 and forcibly tied the US dollar to Saudi crude oil, the elites in Washington had formed a path dependence. They believed that, as the world's largest industrial manufacturing nation and largest crude oil importer, China had a rigid, irreplaceable, and panic-driven demand for traditional energy. They thought that as long as the United States offered certain policy leniency or verbal promises, China would turn a blind eye to America's hegemonic acts of long-arm jurisdiction for the sake of short-term energy security, however. This was exactly the most fatal misjudgment of the era made by American strategic think tanks over the past decade. They completely underestimated the profound heritage of the Eastern Giant's strategic composure, and completely ignored the fact that the underlying logic of China's energy structure had already undergone an earth-shaking reconstruction. Why should China pay for America's mistakes? From industrial data, China is experiencing the grandest energy revolution in human history. As of now, the penetration rate of new energy vehicles in China has broken through the staggering barrier of 50% and even higher. This is not only far ahead globally, but it also fundamentally reverses the domestic demand expectation curve for traditional refined oil products. The new energy industry chain, represented by BYD and CATL, is quietly dismantling the ruling foundation of traditional fossil fuels, using high-density batteries that occupy over half of the global market share, along with unparalleled ultra-high voltage direct current transmission technology. We are using the silicon-based logic of power grids to replace the carbon-based logic of oil pipes. Furthermore, not only does China possess extremely abundant strategic petroleum reserves, but its crude oil import channels have also long achieved a high degree of diversification. From Russia's ESPO pipeline oil to long-term agreements in the Middle East, to increased production in Africa and at home, China simply does not lack those few barrels of Venezuelan crude oil heavily polluted by American politics. Therefore, faced with the so-called goodwill and distress signals released by the Trump camp, The Chinese side's response was a textbook-level diplomatic dimensional strike. At the regular press conference of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, facing foreign media probes, the spokesperson did not show any emotional anger, but instead pointed out two clear paths to fundamentally solve the problem with extreme calmness. The spokesperson explicitly stated that the Chinese side is willing to work with all parties to jointly safeguard global energy security and the stability of industrial and supply chains. But the prerequisite is that two core demands must be met. First, promote the restoration of peace and stability in the Gulf and Middle East regions. This is by no means empty diplomatic rhetoric, but directly plunges a sharp knife into the heart of American geopolitical strategy. Why is the Middle East in chaos? Who is recklessly using military force in the Straits? Who is destroying the trust system of global commodities with unilateral sanctions? The Chinese side's demand here actually stripped away the underwear of the United States as a troublemaker in front of the whole world. Its subtext is, since you Americans stirred up the waves in the Middle East, causing global energy shipping lanes to be blocked, then whoever tied the bell on the tiger must take it off. You must first stop your military hegemony and return peace to the Middle East. You want China to help stabilize oil prices. Fine. First, clean up the mess you made in the Red Sea. You cannot hold a hammer that smashed someone else's window and then turn around to sell them a highly priced security door. Second, Venezuela is a country with full and permanent sovereignty over its natural resources and has the right to independently choose its cooperation partners. Other countries have no right to dictate terms. If the first point is a beatdown of American military hegemony, then this second point completely negates the legitimacy of the financial sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction that the United States is so proud of. For a long time, the United States has treated Latin America as its own backyard, pursuing an extremely selfish Monroe Doctrine, believing that it can arbitrarily freeze a sovereign nation's foreign exchange and arbitrarily take over its national oil company through domestic laws. China drew a clear red line here. Whether to buy Venezuelan oil or not is an equal and mutually beneficial commercial act between two sovereign nations, China and Venezuela. It is not the turn of a third country to issue orders, and no form of political kidnapping is accepted. You want China to take over. Fine. Please have the United States take its dirty hands off Venezuelan territory first and abolish those illegal sanctions. This response never mentioned the United States by name, yet every word struck hard at America's soft underbelly. It is not merely rejecting an absurd commercial sales pitch, but also representing the long-oppressed countries of the global South, declaring war against the old unipolar hegemonic system. Trump's sales pitch was completely bankrupt. On this massive chessboard of global geopolitics, the Americans are still obsessed with the zero-sum game of checkers, attempting to eat all of their opponents' pieces. Meanwhile, China has long since laid down the grand strategy of Go, building a community with a shared future for mankind. The United States thought it held the oil scepter to command the world, not realizing that in China's profound strategic vision, it is nothing more than an acceleratingly decaying old wooden stick stained with the historical mud of hegemony. A true superpower never needs to fill its treasury by robbing the weak. When the hegemon is reduced to a desperate traveler peddling stolen goods everywhere, the collapse of its imperial edifice often lacks only the final sigh. Me, friends, from the artillery fire in the Strait of Hormuz, to the oil field ruins in Venezuela, to the silent games between great powers, what we see is not just barrels of black crude oil flowing, but an era's microcosm of an old hegemonic system struggling in despair. Reality's economic laws and the awakening global South are teaching arrogant power the cruelest lesson. Disrespecting other countries' sovereignty will ultimately only trap oneself in a cocoon. By understanding the shadow war behind crude oil, you also understand the trend of national destinies for the next 10 years. What extreme measures do you think the United States will use in the face of the energy crisis? Has China's new energy rise officially tolled the death knell for the petrodollar? Please, leave your brilliant insights in the comments section. If you feel this deep and hardcore analysis inspired you, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Every share, comment, and like you give is our greatest driving force to continuously tear open the truth of international affairs. I am Alister, and I will see you in the next episode.